I would just like to we're going to record this session, so just so everyone knows, if you speak, put up your hand to be to talk, then you will appear as a panelist. So I'm Pam Eastfeld, the president of PAFSO. I think I know most of the folks on the line. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue au déjeuner de la paz avec l'ancien ambassadeur Roman Waschuk, who's kindly agreed to join us. Roman retired from the department after a long and storied career in 2019. And since then, just in time to get involved in all of this and to become the Ombudsman for business in Ukraine, but now relocated to Poland, where I see that the Poles have really stepped up and are offering a home, a temporary home for him as he's switched his office to sort of crisis mode, dealing with helping business deal with the fallout of the terrible things that are going on there. So before we get going, I would just like to mention that I am chairing this meeting from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, and we acknowledge them as the past, present, and future guardians and caretakers of this land. I think that most of the presentation will be en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser des questions et faire des commentaires dans la langue de votre choix. I'm not going to talk for a long time because I know that Roman has a lot of expertise and a lot of contacts in Ukraine, and that, I really appreciate him taking the time at what is a painful, I think, personal moment for him, especially with so many ties there, and for many of us. And I think it's, really important that we have the maximum time to hear him tell us what he thinks that we need to know about what's going on in Ukraine. And I'm hoping also maybe some ideas on what we could do to help and support your work and the work of others that are working to help the people in the country of Ukraine and in this terrible time. So without further ado, I will turn over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pam, and welcome to all of you. Yes, I'm speaking to you from the regional office of the Polish Small and Medium Business Ombudsman in Krakow, where I've ended up after about a 2.5-week journey west, which started on Valentine's Day, the 14th, when taking embassy security warnings seriously, I decided to spend a week in Western Ukraine working with regional business in the West while looking to see how the situation evolves overall at the national level. Now, just to explain what I've been up to, indeed, I now occupy the position of Business Ombudsman in Ukraine. It's an EBRD-funded office that deals with, in the normal course of events, with protecting both domestic and international business in Ukraine against predatory or other forms of administrative malpractice by government entities. And so we have a staff of 32 people plus me. I'm the only expat. The others are 32 are all Ukrainian citizens. 20 of them are lawyers. The rest are support and communications staff. Maybe give you an idea of what the impact of this unprovoked aggression is on what is essentially an organization filled with middle-class professionals whose lives have now been completely upended. So of our 32 people, 4 have joined the Territorial Defense Forces. And so in our internal office chat, which used to be about things like who's getting coffee, how are things going, now the morning question is who of those, are all those 4 of those still alive? And are they missing any of their equipment? Do they need better body armor? How's their Kevlar helmet holding up, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a rather complete change. 3 of those people in the Army are lawyers, and the other is our IT guy, who also joined up, and I think he took one of our laptops with him, which is currently serving as the battalion IT resource. Approximately 9 others for family configuration reasons. Others have stayed in Kyiv. So whether elderly bedridden parents, they themselves, some of them are disabled, are not so able to travel, they're still back there. We have about another 10 in Western Ukraine, a variety of locations, and about 10 of us now who are abroad, Romania, Poland, etc. We're creating both a hub here in Krakow, thanks to our Polish partners providing some office space for us to regroup, and also one in the city of Ivano-Frankivsk in southwest Ukraine, which has so far been spared punishment, except for the initial days airstrikes by the Russians, which took out the airport at Ivano-Frankivsk. Some of you will recall, because you were there at the time as well, my time at START, as it then was, which dealt with disasters, both natural and human-induced. This experience made me sensitive to the kind of warnings the embassy has given out and President Biden was speaking about. Most people in Ukraine, and as it turns out, most people in Russia, did not take these warnings seriously. They felt that the conflict had been smoldering long enough, and they simply could not imagine the kind of escalation, the kind of all-out war, all-out destruction that is being visited upon the country. And I'll have to admit to you that I was warning them for much of late January, early February, that bad things might happen, but even I could not imagine the sort of things happening now to the cities of Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Ochtyrka, or the western suburbs of Kyiv that are simply being obliterated from the face of the earth. So you had a country that was psychologically not really prepared for this, but with an extremely well-developed coping culture, which meant that in the space of about 48 hours, they went from 0 to 100 when it came to self-organization and taking this very seriously indeed, and organizing resistance. Those of you who've been reading stuff on the analytical side, and I am just making assumptions on the basis of public statements about what is circulating internally, probably will have seen material saying, yeah, maybe the Ukrainians will last 2 or 3 days, given the huge array of armor and resources that the Russians have got lined up against them. We are now in day 12. They are still resisting fiercely. So clearly the huge disproportion in simply material abilities between the Russian and the Ukrainian armed forces is not the determinant. It is largely the fighting spirit of the Ukrainians and legacy institutional post-Soviet problems of the Soviet military that have made them less effective than they would have wished to be. And also the lack of motivation and preparation of Russian forces for what they were about to do. Now, POWs captured will tend to say anything to absolve themselves of responsibility, but it does appear that a large proportion of the Russian force was never told what they were getting into. If anything, they were told you're on exercises, and then you're rolling across some indeterminate border where people will greet you with flowers because they are all yearning for liberation from the neo-Nazi yoke thrust upon them, presumably thrust upon them by having freely elected a Jewish comedian as president in 2019. So the Russian ground campaign has been hampered by lack of motivation among the troops. It's been also affected by 2 or 3 senior generals being picked off by snipers or other special forces operations on the Ukrainian side. But the Russians have compensated for this, unfortunately, by using the kind of force where motivation plays almost no role at all, and that is by Aleppo, Grozny style bombing of infrastructure and civilians. if we could find ways of demotivating rockets, we would be way ahead on this campaign. I think the framing here, in terms of Western perceptions, yes, it's kind of shifted from these guys are doomed to, oh, plucky Ukrainians, but maybe they're doomed anyway. I would say frame it, if they're this plucky, why not help them to actually succeed and help exhaust the Russians who are visiting all this hell upon them. That brings us to the question of Western assistance, NATO assistance, which has really stepped up on the equipment side of things. And again, you see from Russian planes being taken down. There was a day, I think 3 days ago, when 10 Russian aircraft were picked off. That's clearly Stingers and other forms of anti-aircraft handheld equipment operating, as well as the Ukrainian air defense systems, which the Russians did not manage to wipe out counter to expectations on day one. And let me just give you an example there. And I've heard this from talking to people who've been in the region over the past 2 weeks. The Russians, when people talk about Putin living in the past, part of their initial operations were literally based in the past, in the sense that they bombed all sorts of installations that existed on 1990 Soviet maps, such as air defense installations, where the Ukrainians had already moved all the equipment away. But people working with 30-year-old maps were still bombing these empty places in the woods. That is probably how much of Ukrainian air defense survived day one and is still around to make life difficult, but not as difficult as it could be for the Russians. So this brings us to the famous no-fly zone and all the, the emotional Ukrainian calls for it, the dithering and explanations of why it couldn't possibly be done from NATO collectively and from some individual countries, and of course what hides behind that, which is Putin's not terribly veiled threats of nuclear retaliation against anyone who might wish to get mixed up in this fight. I think in looking at this and looking at the psychological side of this, you need to also take into account Putin's expectations, if you will, of Western self-deterrence. We have a lot of people who think a lot, people who, and especially Americans who game everything through. They have computers that have done all these simulations and tell them things. And the assumption, therefore, is that people will debate with themselves until they are frozen and unable to act. And so far, that's largely been true, except for, of course, the significant lethal weapons, and of course on the economic side as well, where I think thanks partly to Canada, the master stroke of freezing central bank reserves has been very effective in tanking the ruble and creating a number of other pressures on Russia. Myself, looking at it from here, from Eastern Poland, I think you could possibly, and this is the gradualist in me speaking, look at a kind of Ukrainian Idlib, in the sense that Turkey has managed to create a no-fly zone in Syria, where the Russians have not been bombing, simply by looking at a discrete portion of the country, which matters to it, and saying, don't go there. And even nuclear armed Russians don't go there because they know the Turks are serious. Now, if you were to take, for example, the city of Lviv and the airport there, which has not been bombed, possibly because the Russians appreciate that the country may need one functional airport at some point. Nearly all the others have been trashed. I think declaring it a sort of humanitarian corridor, airway in and out of the country, not yet contested militarily, might be a way of beginning to improve partly the security, partly the supply situation for Ukraine. As for our little entity with the lawyers we have who aren't out there shooting people right now. Our aim is to help solve cross-border trade problems between the EU and Ukraine, because this supply border, especially the Polish border, is the lifeline at the moment for Ukraine, and also to create a helpline for businesses that have suddenly found themselves in crisis because of the conflict around them. And as rules change, both ones that toughen things up and ones that try to loosen things to help businesses survive in this environment. So each of us can do various things. Our little institution is trying to do some. Those of you working on security policy, and maybe if you think less about self-deterrence and more about what might be achievable, taking some inspiration from the Turks, might also do something in your own right. The important thing is to get going on things and not spend all our time doom scrolling helplessly. So that's maybe a thought I want to leave you with. And as for the rest, je suis prêt à répondre aux questions dans les deux langues, mais aussi en langue polonaise.
Oui. It's a talk. Thanks, Roman. No, this is, I mean, it really is a horrible situation. As we wait to see if there are any questions that come in, maybe I could ask a question too. Did you say that Zelensky is Canadian? I didn't.
No.
Okay. I thought you said a Jewish Canadian president, and I was like, what? I didn't know that.
Comedian.
Okay.
Comedian. Well, of course, which is what he was. Now, so, and I have to say, like a lot of maybe other observers, I have been very, very pleasantly and positively surprised by the way he has stepped up in this crisis. Frankly, one of my main concerns in my Cassandra mode late January, early February, wandering around Kiev, was that he and his presidential administration, who consists largely of people from his production company, would simply implode with this kind of global scale conflict scenario that is like nothing they have ever experienced before in their lives. But frankly, presentationally, they've done very well. And substantively, bravely, he's there, leading from the Kyiv headquarters of the presidency. And he and Ukraine have actually won largely the information war. Now, it helps if you are the innocent victim of unprovoked aggression, yes, but
it's hard to both sides this, really.
Yeah,
the Russians try, but
I'm interested in anyone, if anyone out there wants to act both sides of the question. But the other thing is that because Ukrainian society is uncontrolled and freewheeling, that means you've had a huge panoply of different information sources pumping stuff out spontaneously. And it is, in that sense, much more authentic than a kind of homogenized, state-approved Sputnik RT version of reality. I'll just give you an example, something I picked up from my nephew, who is on the board of an NGO called Teach for Ukraine. They lost today one of their best volunteer teachers. She's a math whiz who won the World High School Math Championships in 2017 with a perfect score, and was killed this morning in a Russian air attack in Kharkiv, where she was working as a humanitarian volunteer. But the image of her and all her friends talking about her is far more compelling than dressing up a couple of hundred people in Z t-shirts like the Russians have, and sort of say, we are the anti-Nazis, check us out in our black shirts as we all march along in well-defined rows. So that's been very much a part of it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Well, that kind of leads into the questions that we got. Mark Lebrom's asking, he's thanking you for your time, and then he says, should Zelensky fall, with the significant blow to morale this would represent, is there an obvious figure in his administration likely to emerge to carry on or lead the resistance nationally? And then he also asks, are you aware of any splits within NATO on the issue of a no-fly zone?
Okay. Yeah, I would also, before answering it, I'd say again, the constant frame is if and when Zelensky falls, if and when Ukraine implodes, what will happen? So I mean, that's kind of the framing that I think we need to at least psychologically get away from, while obviously still very much admitting the possibility in scenario where
he is at risk for sure, right? As you know,
and so I had this conversation before the conflict broke out, when I was worried about implosion as opposed to elimination. And one of the people who used to work on security policy at the presidential office told me, if we're decapitated, we're even better. We like being decapitated. Ukrainians function best in a kind of horizontal decapitated manner. So no, I don't think that, unlike more vertical systems that require single person leadership, what's happening in Ukraine is not that. So would there be another single person who would emerge? I'm not sure, but you will not see resistance suddenly crumble because somebody managed to get to the man, is one thing. Splits in NATO, all I know is that Lithuania is more forward-leaning on this than others. Poland, of course, is now thinking about giving its MiG fighters to the Ukrainians. It's also thinking about what the Russians might do in response to that.
Yeah.
For
example, and it's trying to get a deal, to get some replacements that would be an upgrade.
Yes,
too.
Or whatever from the States. Yes, that could.
Yeah.
That could.
I can't blame them for either.
And I talked to a guy this morning who said that in fact some of the pressure on the Polish zloty in the currency markets is based on the potential blowback from a deal like this and the impact it might have on Poland. So yes, things are online. The issue though is that a Putin who succeeds in subverting Ukraine relatively quickly will not be one who will easily be deterred by anything else, because he's realized that self-deterrence is a powerful tool in dealing with Westerners. So you ask yourself the question, there are two other countries who have received little love letters from Moscow over the past couple of weeks, and that's Finland and Sweden, who received separate letters saying, tell us about the security guarantees you will be giving Russia. And if they don't, they're not in NATO. So
then what?
If Helsinki is bombed, do people go through the same exercise saying, well, or do people say, well, it's in the EU, so it's really part of us, even though it isn't formally part of NATO? But in that case, what really is the substantive argument about Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, my fear, honestly, listening to some of this is, well, I have two, based on, I recognize most of the names in the chat, and most of them know, I think, my background as well, but I did 4 years in Warsaw, 2012 to 2016, and came into the department as an aspiring Kremlinologist back in the day, whatever that was. And, given the history of the whole region, I mean, we, the West, have sold out Ukraine and Poland and all of those countries multiple times, right? And I fear that, the better the Ukrainians do in the fight, the more the Western fear factor legitimately is ramped up. And my fear is that, at some point, is somebody going to be pressuring the Ukrainian leadership to say, okay, you have to take some kind of a deal that's going to be very unpalatable? But at the same time, we're dealing with someone in Russia who is not, I don't think it's controversial to say Putin is not a rational actor. So when he says things like, oh, providing assistance to Ukraine's air defense would be considered an act of war. It's like, what's going to be an act of war tomorrow? I fear that we're already in this scenario, that we already are in a confrontation with Russia, whether we like it or not. And maybe the question we need to be asking ourselves is, do we want to win that confrontation, or what are we prepared to give up? Because there does not seem to be a pacifist, or no, pacifist is not the right word, but as a diplomat, I would always love to see some kind of negotiated solution to minimize this, but I'm not sure that there is one, given the character that we're dealing with.
Pam, you've just done the conclusion to my presentation.
Sorry.
There you go. No, but I agree. And
it is the elephant in the room, though, right?
It is, and we are, it's already happening. Yes, the conflict is already happening. If you think about Macron and Chancellor Scholz and Merkel before that, they were the ones who tried all the classic diplomatic techniques. Let's talk about technical details. Let's talk about the Steinmeier formula. Let's talk about, do we do step 9 of the Minsk list before step 7 or not? And the Russians ultimately got tired of this because it wasn't meeting their domination deadlines. So if you think back over the past year, really, ever since the Putin article about why Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, which appeared last July, and then, interestingly, was distributed to the army, to the armed forces, for each of them to read it. You sort of wonder, why would that be? I think most people in our kind of Western sort of way assume that he was engaging in amateur history for some meta reason. Whereas it turns out, no, he was actually literally setting out the goals of what he intends to do. Then you had the very insulting article in Izvestia, I think it was, back in November by Medvedev, former liberal-ish president and prime minister, saying the Ukrainians are a bunch of useless nobodies, they're vassals, we're not talking to them anymore, we're talking to their masters, the Americans. So this is also what it's really about. It's about an indirect proxy war with NATO, a proxy war with the US, which is what's happening. And then there was the publication by the Russian foreign ministry in December of all their correspondence with Germany and France about the Normandy process, which basically put the kibosh on that, even though the French and the Germans tried to revive it in January and February. So yeah, the problem is, as you pointed out, Pam, is that most of our traditional arsenal of diplomatic fudge options has been tried and has failed, because it turns out, in a kind of Occam's razor moment, that what Putin meant by one people and what he meant by acting on it is literally that. Yeah. As opposed to, I will increase public diplomacy to persuade people of their oneness or something. No, he's killing them to persuade them of their oneness. It won't really work, because even in the zones that the Russians have occupied in the south, and that is generally sort of the most Russian-speaking regions of Ukraine, people are coming out and demonstrating with Ukrainian flags saying, piss off. Actually, they're being a bit less diplomatic. And so their ability to actually implement this fully is not really there. In broader campaign terms, this is not a successful campaign. They are losing. They are killing a lot of people in the process. So the question is, do we want to help them lose, or do we want to give them a chance to eke out a bloody stalemate or win by saying, oh gosh, we couldn't possibly.
Yeah. I mean, I guess years ago, I learned from a, very wise boss, talking mostly about issues management and so on, saying, if you are in an intractable problem, ask yourself, where is this going to end? And then just go there as quickly as you can. But I fear that the end to this is going to be something that is, very difficult for everyone. Yeah, I see we have a question. Ryan Legault is asking, the war has created a policy window for stronger European unity. Yes, funny how these things work. What sort of unity and institutional strengthening can you see coming out of this conflict? For example, Eastern EU countries and the UK have generally been more resistant to the creation of an EU defensive force. Do you see that changing?
Yes, I think that the Germans have now announced a massive reinvestment in defense.
Holy crap, the German foreign policy changed in like an hour.
Yeah, it's
From
like 180 degree
yeah,
change. So yes, I mean, this is a change, a moment of great change in European security and defense policy. And I think the realization that the the methods, the processes, the timelines that have been built into both the EU and NATO don't actually correspond to real life major conflict. They've been overthought, they're over complex, they don't work in real time. So I think that that is going to have to change, and I think the countries that were skeptical about linking their defense efforts together are going to be less so. I think it's also interesting that France, having been burned by the Russians, who clearly were already sending out orders for the invasion while they were pretending to still talk to Macron, is, I think, now more interested in bringing its own slightly feistier attitude to defense to the broader European community. You could see that when Putin issued his nuclear threats, there was much sort of pearl clutching across the continent, except really in France, where the chief of defense staff said, well, we're a nuclear power too, so just watch out when you're talking to us. We have a force de frappe, and so I think a number of the barriers that had been constraining either EU defense or the European pillar of NATO working together will be weakened. Now, one of the questions that's going to come up is Ukraine and the EU. Obviously, there was a huge increase in sympathy for Ukraine. Will that sympathy actually be stronger than the bureaucratic inertia of the EU? Now, clearly, the Poles and I think about 8 or 9 other countries have argued for a fast track for membership for Ukraine. I don't believe that will work for internal EU reasons. What I would want to wish for, but I think even that might be a bit too optimistic, is at the meeting, the 10th, the 11th, that the Europeans actually managed to pronounce the words membership perspective vis-a-vis the Ukrainians, as opposed to, yeah, you've got so much work on, tax reform under the association agreement, we couldn't possibly do this. One of the other things that's interesting in all this is defense reform. I was there for most of the period of Operation Unifier, and of course, Larissa has been there for the other 2 years of Operation Unifier. You could see that actual changes were happening, and that experiences were being exchanged. And frankly, our guys were learning as much from the Ukrainians and their frontline conventional war experiences as they were imparting. But in terms of Brussels International Secretariat staff, if you hadn't yet approved all the appropriate documents, then none of these changes were seen to have been happening. And I remember being in political committee and others trying to tell them, look, pay attention to what's actually happening. Don't just pay attention to your tick box sheets in terms of all this. What we're seeing, and because the kind of conventional wisdom was, small Soviet army can't win against big Soviet army. And the Ukrainians were seen as not having ticked the boxes to stop being a small Soviet army. But what we're seeing in reality is that they are operating as a very flexible force. Heavy application of special operations forces, which were largely trained by the US. A lot of work by snipers, a lot of them trained by Canada under Op Unifier. and are basically waging a very un-Soviet campaign. So the conventional wisdom about the Ukrainian forces and the ineffectiveness of Western assistance has turned out to be wrong. Now, again, people are very much still under the impact of Afghanistan, the implosion. Afghanistan had, probably 20 times more money spent on it than Ukraine in defense reform, in defense support. And so the assumption was, well, Afghanistan crumbles, so Ukraine will crumble too. But no, not all analogies work all the time.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. I'm inviting people to send questions or to put up their hand if they want to be promoted to a panelist and appear on the screen to talk. But in the meantime, maybe could I ask you, and I know this is a difficult sort of question and maybe an unfair perspective to ask of you, but I'm wondering, we've talked about Putin and we've talked about, we know a little bit about what's been going on in terms of the, information control and, I don't even think media control is the right word in Russia, but, the fact that the ordinary people don't get, proper information and don't have information to make decisions there. But I'm wondering, what about the sort of middle level? There must be people in Russia who do have some access to what's really going on. And do you have any sense of what their thinking is? I know that there are a lot of oligarchs who owe everything to Putin and they're scared of him. But how about, what about the sort of intellectual level or the senior bureaucrat level? Like, is there anybody out there who has some independent views on this, and what might those be? Do you have a sense?
Yeah. So I think when it comes to officials and bureaucrats, we've probably seen literally no more than 5 who have spoken out or resigned. You have the Russian executive director at the World Bank who said, I cannot abide this, I'm resigning. And a few others, I think the Belarus consul general somewhere resigned, but very small numbers given what's happening and what's at stake. So I think what you have is a general sort of societal anomie, if you will, where people simply acceptance of what has been imposed over the last 20 years of Putin's reign. So I was for about 10 days of my journey westward, accompanied by a lady who is my nephew's future mother-in-law. My job was to get her to Belgium to her other daughter, along with their Yorkie terrier. And she comes from a small town in northern Ukraine, where there are a lot of cross-border family relationships. And she was freaking out because of their relatives who lived in either Moscow or Vladivostok just refusing to believe them when they called them and told them, like, we're being bombed. No, you're not. And so what, she obviously said, I'll never talk to them again. But I think the problem is that these people, if they were to accept that reality, would have to change their attitude to their place in society. They would have to somehow become oppositionists, and they know what happens to oppositionists. And so it is easier to maintain your peace of mind and your frame of reference than it is to accept anguished phone calls from your very own close relatives. And that does show how strong the conditioning is. Now, we've seen with COVID and the truckers in Canada, or the social divide in the States, that a kind of tribalism, a kind of group think that requires you to accept certain verities and limitations can be extremely powerful, even where there is no state coercion.
Yeah.
And here we have both media manipulation and state coercion. And so your brother calling you up and telling you he's being bombed, unfortunately, can't stand up to that.
Yeah. So what do you, I mean, do you see any hope for, I mean, who, if we were, I mean, I've been super impressed by the Ukrainian info ops, and how they've managed to get all, you know, all of the powerful stories out. And but who would we as the West, is there anyone that we can be targeting? I mean, who could we reach out to influence?
Yeah. Uh, I would say this is an opportunity for those who are the Putin verstehers, the people close to Putin in Western countries, to use their networks to talk to the Russians who can make a difference, who could shift opinion. Because I think it won't happen through a mass movement. There's too much of that kind of mass anomie to get 1905 or 1917 going again, I don't think. But to talk to elite people whose economic lives are being destroyed as we speak, to persuade them that they need to take Putin's finger off the button. Their lives can return to normal if this ends. Now, obviously, Putin is telling us Ukraine's life can return to normal, sort of, with many thousands dead and burned out buildings, if it simply capitulates to his agenda. But there needs to be a proposition there saying these sanctions have been imposed. They're super tough. They could be tougher, I think, buying oil, etc. You know, easy for Canada to refuse doing it, but others need to do it as well. But to tell them that yes, Russia will inch back into polite society if they pull this guy's finger off. But
Yeah, yeah. Oh, fair enough. Hey, we've got a couple questions. So one from Richard Martin Nielsen says, Lithuanian NGOs today launched a Call Russia initiative to have Russian-speaking Lithuanians call randomly assigned Russians to try to talk through what the situation in Ukraine and Russia looks like from the outside. You've spoken about how this works or doesn't in family units. Any hope to work without a family linkage? I have to say, I've been really impressed at the ways people are coming up with to try to get information into Russia, like people using Google reviews and Yelp reviews of restaurants to, so that's, yeah, super impressive.
I think it's worth trying. I mean, even if only 1 in 100 or 1 in 50 turn out to be persuasive, then it's probably worth doing. And again, it gives people who have language abilities something to do, as opposed to simply feeling helpless about this. So, so there's a therapeutic side to it for the people doing it at our end. And again, if you even break through in 1%, 2%, 3%, you're already maybe setting off a chain of realizations that could help get us to a better place.
Yeah. No, and I think that having something to do is very important. And that maybe we kind of underestimate that in some of these things, you know, with the convoy, like when they were occupying Ottawa, one of the things I thought is, you know, these people are having fun and doing something after a long period of maybe being stuck at home and feeling helpless. And I think that was probably 90% of the ordinary convites, you know. It's like, but I was so annoyed. I was just like, you're all jerks. And really, it's an understandable kind of an impulse that could be tapped for a lot of things. Carol Ann is asking, are there any Western political players who could bring Russia to the negotiating table quietly or publicly, or is this option not being pursued? If not, what options does the international community have? I guess there already is a negotiating table. It's just how serious Russia is, right, about what is actually going on.
Yeah, I think maybe if you wanted to think outside the box, going to the Russians through other countries that are being indirectly affected. Ukraine is a major food producer, and you are seeing already an impact on global wheat prices, because in this case, both Ukraine and Russia, the Black Sea grain trade are closed. And that's about 30% of global exports right there. So maybe approaching the Russians through Egypt, which I think gets over a quarter of its wheat from Ukraine, India. Not because I think expressing it in a kind of NATO Russia way plays into Putin's kind of US centric paranoia that I'm waging war. But hearing also from the Chinese, now we're not best placed to whisper in their ear, I don't think, Canada,
No.
but others might be. But players whose interests are being hurt by the global food and economic dislocation this is causing, to try and talk the Russians off their ledge.
Sounds good. That was another question somebody asked about the Putin-Xi summit and closer Sino-Russian relations that preceded Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I think you've sort of talked about.
Well, in one respect, now obviously there's the people are looking at the Taiwan Ukraine parallelism in the sense that in a different sort of way, Xi believes that Taiwan and China are one people and that he has the right to act on it, and that the outcome of this conflict can have a major impact on how the Chinese look at whether they can use force to achieve their aims, because they're also looking at the Western tendency to self-deter. So they're going, okay, we try and invade Taiwan, conventional, given where we are, et cetera, our conventional advantage is considerable. Would anyone resort to nuclear arms? Would we? Would they all just be freaked out all the time and have debates and talk shows about it while we actually send in the submarines?
Yeah.
So that is there now. Now the Chinese are also a way the Russians are trying to get around being cut off from the international financial system. So I think the Russian credit cards are being attached to a Chinese-based system to allow them some outside access. Now, not huge, but certainly if you're looking at the Chinese market, it's there. So, but are the Chinese willing to go all the way? No, they've abstained on resolutions at the UN rather than voting with Russia.
Yeah.
With Russia, it's 5 countries: Eritrea, Syria, Nicaragua, I think. So not a whole lot.
Yeah.
So those might be persuadable, but I think other sort of non-aligned, especially food consumer states, would be ones that would see it in their interest that this should stop.
Yeah. No, fair enough. I see there's another question. Our PM is in Europe at the moment, and Canada has committed nearly 1 billion in resources to support the Ukrainians. How far do you think Canada should engage vis-a-vis backstopping European leadership? The difference between being shoulder to shoulder with our allies versus we've got your back.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are shoulder to shoulder in Latvia, which is right on the Russian border, and Belarus, which is now pretty much the Russian border. So I don't think we have a "we've got your back" option, certainly in strictly NATO tripwire military terms. Given our also investment in CETA and sort of other aspects of the Euro-Atlantic space as opposed to Central and Eastern Europe per se, disruption to all of that would have considerable impact. So I think once again, we're seeing that Senator Dandurand's image of Canada as the flame-proof house sitting somewhere from the 1930s, it probably isn't going to play out that way. We need to be with the fire brigade closer to where things are happening.
Yeah. I guess my concern is, do we really have the capacity? And I realize that that's probably a question for people other than us, but what's the capacity at the moment of CAF to really get into things? The news out of the organization has not been good for the last couple of years. The exit from Afghanistan, I mean, peripherally involved us, but I think we were quite lucky that it didn't actually involve us more, because how much would we have been able to do? I mean, I ended up working with a bunch of people that I formerly served with, trying to help some of our interpreters and so on get out, and they mobilized like crazy, but all as individuals basically. It was not really an institutional kind of response.
One of the things that I sort of learned on returning to Canada in 2019 and then followed where the pandemic broke out is that we've become very consultative, but we're kind of like not so much about doing things anymore. Our various structures are good at talking about things, about looking at this side and that side, being inclusive. But then when something comes up, people tend to say, "Oh, not my jurisdiction, not me, not there." And you were talking about the convoy. Looking at it from abroad, you see, what? Politicians all saying, "Oh, we couldn't possibly tell the police what to do." Really?
Yeah. Well, and then when you see how other demonstrations and everything have been treated, I mean, a friend of mine was telling me about a demonstration on, for healthcare workers that was broken up by the police, and they were given 5 minutes to leave. 5 minutes. And yet somehow this managed to stay there for 3 weeks. Like,
but it's part of the broader thing, and again, COVID brought it up, is that our systems have not been tested a whole lot by actual big problematic events. Mm-hmm. And so they tend to exist more on paper than in reality. And the ability of different parts of our system to work together, despite a proliferation of committees, is not huge. So, but put it this way, the Ukrainians on about February 22nd didn't think they had all that much capacity to deal with a threat. And as of the morning of the 24th, they realized they had to have it. And so it appeared. So I think part of it depends on our assessment of the urgency. Is this really still happening in a far off place and not of direct concern to us? People can feel sentimental about it. Ukrainian Canadians can go around waving flags. Church halls can be visited, etc. Or is it, in fact, the first serious step of a confrontation in which, in the Euro-Atlantic space, in which NATO and allies like Canada are actually participants as opposed to bystanders?
Well, and for Canada, I mean, look north. Russia is not that far away if you look north. It's or even if you look west, frankly. It's yes. If you look far enough, it's not, there's a continent in between us in one direction, but not in two more.
Well, Russia is not really hard up for territory.
Yes.
It's a fairly big place. It just wants to be bigger. That's all.
Do you think, I mean, what is the ultimate end? I mean, does Putin actually want Ukraine to be actually part of Russia, or does he just want a puppet government that he controls in just?
Just, right. I think he wants, if anything, a government that would say, yes, we are one people with Russia. We are nominally still administratively separate to keep that vote. It's kind of like Ukrainian SSR in Soviet days.
Yeah.
And you, oh great Vlad, have brought us to this amazing realization. That's what he wants. And of course, though, don't forget those draft treaties, which are about removing US nuclear weapons from Europe, about pushing NATO infrastructure back to 1997 or before, et cetera. So it's essentially what he's about is he is about erasing the humiliation of the end of the Cold War for Russia, of which for him personally, because of his religious, messianic, and other beliefs, the existence of an independent Ukraine with an independent mind is the most egregious and obnoxious. But all the rest of it is part of the package.
Yeah.
So if you're Poland, if you're the Baltics, if you're Finland, you need to keep that in mind.
No, good point. Good point. I see we're getting close to 10 and we asked for an hour of your time. I have a little bit more time myself. I don't know if you do, if there are a few other questions, but maybe as we're sort of getting to the end, could I ask you, oh, I see one other question has come in. Mark asks, do you see time as being on the side of Russia or Ukraine at this point? I've heard arguments both ways, time to resupply, reinforce the invasion force versus time for the sanctions to work, Western weapons to arrive. Thanks again. I'm wondering, yeah, that's a good question too. Like all these weapons and everything are coming in from the West, right? Like on the Western border.
Yep.
And I know they haven't shut that down yet. I wonder how long it's going to take them to do something about that.
Well, here, I think it's been fortunate that there are two factors. One is that the Ukraine-Belarus border north of Western Ukraine is largely impenetrable bog and marshes, so hard to take tanks across. The second thing is that even though Lukashenko has prostrated himself at Putin's feet, the Belarus army seems to be in no shape or mind to join in. There have been various reports that they were about to join in, but there have been reports afterwards saying that they were facing mutiny in the ranks. People just saying, no, we see no purpose in this, we're not going. So that, I think, has been a bit of a saving grace, even though Belarus has allowed its territory to be used. So the fact that that the Russians are able to go through Belarus, are able to launch both air and missile attacks from Belarus, has been a huge disadvantage for Ukraine. Otherwise, the Russians would be bottled up on the left bank of the Dnipro. This way, they were able to come in behind, and you have all these battles on the western approaches to Kyiv. Time is on whose side? I think in land war terms, it's on Ukraine's side. The Russians do not have major reserves of spanking new equipment or motivated people they can bring up. On the other hand, in terms of cities being bombed to smithereens, time is on Russia's side because they can maintain and pick up the pace of that. So, and then I think Western sanctions need to be cranked up some more, especially on the energy side, because again, ironically, as energy prices rose because of the conflict, Russia actually had its best day ever, I think, last Sunday or Saturday, in terms of money raised from oil and gas sales, at least best day ever in many months. So the pressure on Germany is increasing to say no to sales. The French have said they're ready to do it. Of course, they have a very large nuclear program and did not shut off all their nuclear power plants. So it requires, again, that's another form of rethinking. European green energy was based on no political impacts on any forms of energy supplies. That's no longer the case. So it's one of a lot of different things that are going to have to change and change quickly.
Yeah, wow. I mean, the implications of this are huge. And, you know, one of the things that we had started doing, and I think they're still doing it in foreign policy research when I was there, was doing policy gaming, you know, like the equivalent of war gaming, but for political events and issues. And I don't know if they've done one on this kind of a thing, but it would be, I think, very interesting to do a policy game and have people playing the different, you know, bringing the different factors in and looking at the broader, you know, the implications, the global implications for the future of how all of these things are going to affect us. I mean, I've seen some calls, you know, let's get the Chinese on side to, you know, put pressure on the Russians. And my question is, well, that might work, but what are the Chinese going to ask for? And what would that mean? You know, same as, I mean, the Chinese kind of saved us in, you know, 2008, right, in the recession, and some people argue, and there was you know, there was a knock-on effect from that we're seeing in many ways today. So I think it would be really interesting to game that stuff out. But, you know, even when I was there was a reluctance at Global Affairs to even want to run some of these games if they were too controversial, because what if word got out that we were thinking about the possibility of World War III? And to my response to that was, what if word got out that we're the Department of Global Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and we're not thinking about how we would cope with something that amounts to a catastrophe? I mean,
right. Well, and as it turns out, you don't need to just game it, because Vladimir Putin has decided to put on a real life version there.
We're living it. Yeah.
He was not afraid of thinking about these things. And I think, though, from a departmental point of view, that looking carefully at the responses and doing lessons learned, what's happening now, Embassy Kyiv, Embassy Warsaw, Be NATO, Brew, coordination with national defense, etc. All those things are actually sort of real life examples that can be looked at in terms of in terms of assessing things and figuring out what the way forward should be, but then also lessons learned in case this gets uglier in more directly Canadian terms.
Exactly. Could I ask, maybe as we get to the end, I know, I mean, there's so much in some ways, there's so much information about what's going on that
Yep.
it's like drinking from a fire hose, but it's also hard, I think, to assess what the quality of that information is, especially if it's not from the mainstream, the major sources that we're familiar with. Do you have any advice for us on sources that we could look at that might provide a little bit closer perspective, but that aren't completely info ops?
Right. I found that some of the US hard power analysts do quite a lot of assessing in real time, and they try not to simply take everybody's posted video at face value. Guys like Rob Lee and Michael Kaufman. One of the ironies, though, and this is another analyst I found very interesting. I initially thought him a bit too cosmic and out there, but he's turned out to have the right instincts on what's going on now. He's a guy named Bruno Macias, Macaes, a former Portuguese Europe minister. I remember meeting him at Zaporizhia Airport like 2015 or 16. And he's pointed out that hard power analysts managed to make the right call in saying that there would be a conflict at a time when most of the intent or broadly sort of political analysts couldn't believe it. But the hard power analysts are so wedded to counting bits of stuff that they've actually mostly got the relative performance of the armies wrong, because they don't account for fighting spirit, motivation, internal cohesion, etc. So you need both of those factors in there. But yeah, Kaufman, Michael Kaufman, Rob Lee on the that side, then Macias as a kind of outsider looking at this, but with insights. Among Ukrainians, there's a guy named Vladimir Yermolenko. He's a philosopher who tries to kind of frame things on a daily basis. The Kyiv Independent is now obviously is in Kyiv, and so has a particular view on things, but they are generally sort of Western trained journalists who try to present a reasonably accurate picture of what's going on.
Yeah, thank you. I also used to, when I was in the region, I'm still used to like ASW, the Polish open source intelligence analysis. It's what's it? Institute for Study of the Eastern Studies.
Study of the East, yeah. And I think PISM, which is the sort of more the international
think tanky one. Yes.
they have some pretty good people too.
Yeah. So those are good sources, because I worry
And,
a little.
and you know who else?
Mm.
Read Finns.
Say again?
Read Finns.
Mm.
Finns, with their history of the Winter War, have a unique sort of vibe and understanding of what standing up as the little guy to Russians means, and also living next door to Russians. So the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, FIIA, they and people around them put out very interesting stuff.
Okay, maybe if it's okay with you, I'm writing these down and I've got the tape, but I might send you an email after and ask if you could give me your list, and then I'll circulate it to interested.
My mixtape to date me.
Yes. No, so thank you very, very much. We're coming up on 10 after 10. I'll give maybe a last call for final questions or comments, or if anyone wants to put up their hand, and I can open up the mic and video for them to speak. I am not seeing anybody. So going once, twice, 3 times. Just to let PAFSO members know, I just got the email from our office to let me know that no one else has decided to challenge me for the presidency. So you guys are going to be stuck with me for another 3 years until 2025. So that is, from my perspective, that's good news. I hope it's good news for other folks as well. And there's certainly going to be, I think, a very interesting time for PAFSO and PAFSO members in all of this. So maybe I will say thank you, Roman, and we really appreciate all the time that you've taken. I hope that you will come back. Do you have any last words before we go? After I stole your
just say always look at the whole spectrum of scenarios, including potential positive outcomes.
So, I mean, what do you see? Maybe that could be a good last note to end on. What do you see as some of the positive outcomes?
What I would see as a positive outcome, it's not the most likely outcome, but it's a positive outcome, would be the Ukrainian ground forces maintaining control of most of the country, the economic sanctions biting and being attenuated, and Russia then either having an internal change of leadership or having to negotiate with far less maximalist demands. If ultimately, and the Europeans need to come through with some sort of membership perspective for Ukraine. Ultimately, if you had a Ukraine minus Crimea, minus the previously occupied Donbass, not the whole Donbass, on a kind of good riddance basis from the rest of Ukraine, assumption that it would not join NATO but would join the EU. In other words, Finlandization, but not in the sense of Finland post-war, but Finland today. Western linked, understandable territory, part of the EU, able to live its own life without being an aircraft carrier for any other global power. That would be the current fantasy football scenario.
Okay, well, listen, thank you for that, and I think we all hope that we will see these positive outcomes, and that we'll do what we can to contribute to them. So thank you, Roman. Thank you, everybody, and à la prochaine. I will end the session now, and thanks very, very, very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.